Hi everyone and welcome. I have in front of me a piece of plastic that was covering one of my worm bins, and like I usually do, since the plastic is usually a place where a lot of the moisture that's in the worm bin that would normally just evaporate into the air, the plastic is there to catch that moisture. Since the plastic is usually the place where a lot of that moisture condenses, it's a real popular spot for the worms. So I always do my best to try to make sure I'm not leaving any worms on the plastic when I take the plastic off to work on the bins. And in the case of this piece of plastic, I'm just amazed at some of the tiny worms that I'm seeing on here. And I've already fished off the majority of them, but I'm still seeing a couple now that I'm looking more closely at it with some brighter lights on overhead. And I tell you, some of these can't be bigger than the size of an eyelash. They are so tiny. So I've been doing my best to make sure I've taken all of them off before I go to, any further lengths in working on my bin. So I'm going to see if I can fish off these last couple little worms before we proceed. Because this one worm, for example, I seriously doubt it's going to be visible on the camera. But I picked the little guy up right onto my index finger, and yeah, that's a worm. So small, it's moving. I was starting to worry that it's so tiny that it might have already dried out and might be, affected by the dryness. But I'm going to put this little guy right back into the bin where he belongs. But I think I see one or two more that I want to take care of. And then we'll get ourselves going on the bin that I want to work on today. All right. These little guys are a little bit bigger than what we saw a moment ago, but not by much. So you have to assume that these little guys must have just been hatched out of their cocoons very recently. And it's so easy to miss them. I just worry that I'm gonna, leave some of them behind, and, maybe I'm just getting a little bit overly detail oriented. I could simply fold the plastic in half to try to limit the amount of evaporation that happens here. Try to keep some moisture on the plastic so that any worms that might still remain on it, so they don't get any sort of a negative effect. Because usually I could just see them all and scrape them off, but I just started realizing that each of my fingertips has a worm on it at this point. I just realized that some of these little guys are so tiny that I could very easily be missing them unless I've got, some really nice bright lights on, making sure that I have gotten all of them off. So I am thinking maybe the best bet here would be to simply fold this in half and let some of this moist material kind of touch each other and not be exposed to the air. And then hopefully any remaining little tiny baby worms on this will be safe from drying out and perishing. So let me get these little guys off my fingertips. All right, I guess our best effort here is probably just going to be to fold this in half to try to prevent any further drying. And hopefully by doing so we've limited their exposure to the dangerous dry air. And the bin that I had removed that plastic from is the one you see right here. And at this point it does look like, with the exception of the couple worms that I dropped onto here a moment ago, all the larger ones seem to have made their way off this paper, at least under it, to a point where they're not feeling the overhead lights scaring them away. But I believe, since there are still a couple worms, I could see one here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fold this piece of paper in half as well, just to try to protect any worms that might be right on the surface from drying out, although I think that the paper will probably hold a little bit of moisture for the short period of time that we're going to be working in here. So it shouldn't be too big of a threat, but I guess it's kind of a better safe than sorry kind of thinking. But before we do that, why don't we get this bin up onto the bench so it's easier to see what we're doing, and then we're going to get started. So now here on the bench we've got a little bit better light to see what we're doing. And those of you who are regulars on my channel and might have already recognized which bin this is of all my bins just based on its position on my shelf, might already know that we're in here to do a specific task. And let me just enlighten the rest of you who are not regulars on my channel. I've got a little bit of a kind of a short cheat sheet here summarizing where we stand right now. So not mentioned here on the board is the fact that this 87-day-old red wiggler bin is now my second oldest bin. The other bin that was next to it is in excess of 120 or so days of age at this point. But this bin right here, the second oldest of my bins, did seem like it sort of blew by the oldest of my bins. And a few weeks ago, back when the bin was still only 63 days of age, I had given its last feeding, and that was 24 days ago. And that was the 9th feeding overall. And at that point I decided, the bin was starting to look pretty good, and I wanted to really start steering it towards completion. So I left that 9th feeding 24 days ago as the final feeding. And to really drive things home, it was 8 days ago, a little bit over a week ago, that I went in there and I tried to pick out any residual scraps of that last feeding and any larger chunks of bedding that were still in the bin. And I thought that by doing so, I'd really be able to help this bin beeline it to the finish line so that we can start thinking about harvesting it. And why don't I get to work on removing this piece of paper, because all these worms that are sitting out here on the surface are probably in a certain degree of distress as a result of the bright lights overhead. And I could keep explaining what's happening in the meantime. So the idea here was to initiate 8 days ago, or actually 24 days ago, technically speaking, a final push towards completing the normal composting phase of the bin and help transition the bin towards depopulation and migrating the worms out of the material. So to that end, these worms have been left to try to make the best final effort at reducing any little scraps of material in this bin down into worm castings, so that at some point soon we could try to collect up all those worm castings to be used out in the garden. But first we would also want to try to migrate the worms out of the material to relocate them into some other fresh bin to get them to work in a new environment. The one thing I'm definitely noticing in here as I look around, and it's always pretty easy when you have a lot of fresh castings scattered across the top, you can see a lot of worm cocoons. So I'm spotting them all over the place, and they're pretty dark in color, some of them. I can see one over there, I see one over there, I see a fairly large one right there, I see two right here. And I don't know if they're coming across on the camera, but almost everywhere I look, I see a cocoon, a cocoon, a cocoon, a cocoon there, and there. Right there as well, right there too. And basically it looks like this is a pretty good bin for breeding it. Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that the food supplies in the bin have been dwindling, and maybe it's sort of a last-ditch effort on the population in the bin to try to propagate, maybe with the assumption that they're going to run out of food and maybe they'll perish, but at least trying to leave cocoons behind to enable the next generation to continue in their place. So I'm never really quite sure how to trigger the activity of breeding, but I think I've heard some things that suggest that if you're putting the worms into sort of a situation where they feel it might be close to the end, so to speak, that might actually trigger that type of behavior in the worms. But so now just recapping what had happened in here over the past 87 days. 24 days ago, the last feeding, the 9th feeding, was applied to this, and I treated that as the last feeding of the normal composting phase. But we're not done yet, so in my mind, this bin is now transitioning into the kind of follow-up or final phase of depopulation and migration. And there's different approaches people can use to depopulate their worm bins, but the approach that I've been using most recently and most frequently is the method where you basically let the worms do all the work. So after 24 days of no fresh food being added to this bin, and for that matter after 8 days of all the remaining larger scraps of food being removed from the bin, you would have to think that the worms are definitely getting to the point where they would probably like to get some fresh food. So the whole idea here is to use that as motivation to try to get the worms to exit the castings on their own voluntarily. And to do that, we're going to be basically feeding them again now for the 10th time after all that time. But they're going to be doing it in a way that the feeding is concentrated on the far edge of the bin. And, we're going to push all of the casting material over this side. And over time, we're hoping that the worms are going to make their way over into the fresh setup that has all the new food and fresh bedding and all that other stuff that they're probably craving at this point. So a lot of explanation. We've not even looked inside the material to see how it looks. So I think it's time to start probing into here to see how the material is coming along. And I think basically you kind of know what to expect. The material is really nice right there on the surface, but it's pretty much the same all the way through. And I guess the main expectation here was that hopefully the majority of this larger material would be depleted by now, but it's not perfect. It's certainly not a store grade compost, because there are still little bits of sticks and stems, pieces of the leaves that had been placed in here as part of the bedding once upon a time, and they're very fragile. They're very easily broken just by me twirling them in my fingers, and that's about the extent of what you find in here anymore. There's maybe a little chunk of cardboard, which might take them a little longer to consume. So in my mind, if I find little bits and pieces of scraps of bedding and maybe even food in here still, it's not a fail. In my mind, that's perfectly normal, because I didn't go crazy trying to clear out every last scrap of food and bedding I could find. I just went through here kind of quick, trying to get what I can to try to help them focus on all the small remaining bits, and to find little bits of like an avocado shell or a little stick like this, perfectly normal. And like I said, I'm not really preparing this stuff to be sold on the open market. The main purpose of me doing this is so that I can throw it in my garden, and I don't have a problem with it being kind of in that imperfect state. So I'm really glad to see that no matter where I look in this bin, I went right down to the bottom to see how the material was. And it's kind of nice when the material doesn't even stick to your hand. It all just flakes right off, even if it's the material that you fished right out of the bottom of the bin, where it would be probably expected to be the most damp material, all the way down at the bottom. And you can probably also expect that the material in this bin is pretty consistent throughout, because when I went through here trying to pick out those food scraps that I had found 8 days ago, I did rummage through here pretty thoroughly, kind of stirring everything up, making everything kind of consistent throughout. So there should be no hot spots, so to speak. There should be no concentrations of anything in this bin. It should just be a pretty consistent blended material all throughout. So if there's little scraps of stuff here and there, it's kind of what you would expect to find everywhere within the bin. So there's no one spot where you would expect to find a concentration of food and therefore no concentration of worms. But as you can see, no matter where we look, the concentration of worms is kind of high anyway, regardless of where we look, because it's a fairly heavily populated bin. It's funny, I think that little piece of material that I had in my hand a moment ago, I think that was a chunk of ginseng root, because it just had that interesting smell to it. It's a smell that I noticed a couple times in my bins and never knew what it was that I was sensing. And even when I stumbled on that particular food item, I didn't really recognize it as what it was. And I believe it was just during one of my recent check-ins on one of my bins that I kind of came to the realization of what that was over there. So I was going to treat today as sort of a decision point to look at the material and try to decide if it was in fact mature or had reached that stage of maturity that we are in fact going to be ready to proceed. So I don't think it's necessary to delay the process any longer. I do feel pretty confident that the material in this bin is exactly the way I would want it. And, over the time it'll take for the worms to work their way out of this material and make their way over into the new feeding zone that I'm going to set up for them, they'll also continue to work this material down even better. So Even though it's very nice already the way it is right now, it'll only improve over time, and that's for sure. So what I'm going to be doing over here on this edge, as I mentioned earlier, is setting up a feeding zone. So I've already set up a few things over here on the bench next to me. I've got a tray of food. I'm also going to use my little barrier trick. So I sometimes set up this barrier with a whole bunch of holes punched into it so that the worms can get through it. But it's my way of trying to distinguish where the finished castings are on one side of the bin and where the feeding zone is on the other side of the partition. So I kind of like doing it this way. And the other thing that's going to help us really clearly see where the food items are is that I've got some newspaper that I'm going to bundle the food into as well, which is going to help kind of contain it and constrain it. And then I could put that piece of cardboard up against it, and then we'll backfill with the material, and then we'll let it go again. And then we'll see what sort of results we get, maybe in another week's time or so. And I've already actually built the bin that the worms are going to be moved into once I've migrated them out of here. And I anticipate doing it in a couple phases. So usually after about a week's time, with a bin that's not been fed in quite a while, you get pretty good action. You get worms moving over pretty fast to try to take advantage of the fresh food supply, because they just haven't had any fresh food in so long. So I think I'm just going to grab a sheet of newspaper, start loading it up with some food, and then we'll start constructing this feeding zone over here. Horizontal migration feeding zone. That's what I refer to it as. So let's build that up now. So now you see this newspaper I'm using. It's got a fair bit of colored ink on it. And it's usually not a problem if you're using colored ink, as long as it's not that really glossy stuff that you see sometimes. As long as it's the matte finish colored ink, it shouldn't be a problem. So I'm not sweating it. And as a matter of fact, I think that the ink is actually soy-based, so I think the worms might even prefer that over just plain paper. So I've got a number of things here that need to go. Number one is, look at that moldy, nasty berries. This package of berries was actually in the freezer to try to halt the growth of that mold. So it's a little bit frozen together, but I definitely want to remove this piece of wicking paper that's right beneath it. So gosh, with that one little handful of material, we're almost full already, but I definitely want to include a little bit more stuff. So I'm just going to grab a handful of material out of my little freezer bag collection of stuff here. And I think with that we're going to have ourselves a pretty good sized little bundle of food. The nice thing about preparing their food in these little bundles is that not only are you giving them food, but right away at the same time you're also providing a good valuable source of bedding material, a carbon food source that goes hand in hand with the nitrogen rich food that they're getting that's inside the bundle. So it's always a good idea to try to keep a pretty decent balance between the two. So I had two pieces of paper, and I thought that if I did it right, I can fit them in here side by side. So it does look like we're pretty much halfway across. So let's do the same, because I've got another similar package, not quite as moldy, but just as, you know, gone beyond the point of fit for human consumption. So it too is going in as worm food. Like I did before, I just want to make sure I'm not putting in this piece of paper. I'm not certain it's 100% straight up paper, which wouldn't be a problem in a worm bin, obviously. But I think this stuff is something else. So until I know for a fact that it's something that the worms can consume, I just prefer to exclude it. That's just my preference. Although I'm sure in time it would just, you know, remain in the bin and it would be sitting there, and then I can do away with it. So if any scraps of it are in fact not compostable, I'll be able to fish it out later. It'll be clear that that piece of material that's just way too frozen to be removed right now. I should be able to notice that at some point in the future. So same thing here. I'm just going to grab another handful of now frozen food scraps out of my little collection of kitchen scraps, and you can see it's a whole variety of different things. There's a chunk of carrot, a chunk of potato, a chunk of cucumber. Pretty much you name it in here. Everything goes as far as I'm concerned in most cases. Although I generally do try to avoid certain no-no types of foods that might be a little bit more acidic than others, or foods that I know that the worms aren't going to really bother with too much. And that's the stuff that I put outside into my outdoor compost bin. So this is looking pretty good right here. I'm also going to scatter in some leaves out of my little leaf collection box over here. But before I do that, I'm going to start setting up the partition wall that I brought down here to use. So I kind of designed it in a way that the portion of it that's littered with holes, all kinds of large holes for the worms to be able to cruise through, is the part that's down low. Sometimes I'll even try to make sure that the holes are quite wide open and not going to be seen as a barrier to prevent the worms from moving through the barrier. And this is totally optional. It's just kind of whatever, you know. It's more of a visual aid for me, so I can more readily see where the feeding zone has been set up. Because sometimes if you just build the feeding zone right there adjacent to the finished compost, you might find that it all starts to look very alike. But sometimes I do want to be able to distinguish them from one another. So I tried to estimate what the final height of this stuff would be once I backfilled it into here. And I folded it there. And I guess the other nice thing is that it's going to create a little bit of a lid over there to try to help keep the moisture down within that section, to help keep it really tempting for the worms so they'll want to go there. And I'll put some plastic over this as well to make sure that the moisture that's in here will in fact stay over there rather than evaporating away. And the plastic that had been covering everything up else here is what I'm going to use, but the way I'm going to use it is I'm going to keep it folded in half the way it is over there on the side, and cover up only the feeding area at this point, and start allowing this finished casting material to dry off a little bit more. Even though it's in great shape already, the further drying of the material will provide further incentive for the worms to move out. So I don't need too much of this. I just wanted to use it as a little bit of a filler to close up any holes and gaps around the little food bundles. I've also got a little bit of coffee that we could sprinkle on top too. But before we do that, I think I'm going to begin with the backfilling of this feeding area. So I'm going to see if I can get all this food and bedding material that belongs in the feeding zone back over into the feeding zone. And then we can start backfilling the cardboard so it stays put. This, I don't know, this might be a sheet of, or a string of plastic or something, which doesn't seem like it's getting broken down, so I'm pulling it out. But yeah, this material is so nice. Every now and then when I find a avocado shell or something, I suppose I have the option to just throw it over into the feeding zone. Anything that might remain as a reason for the worms not to leave, any sort of lingering bits of food or whatever, you know, there's no harm in moving that over too. Because really you want the worms in your feeding zone. You want them migrating out of these finished castings, because you don't want it to be like a never-ending process either. You'd really like to see it happen rather rapidly, so that the worms can be used to start off a fresh bin somewhere else. So this is starting to look pretty good. I just like to, in general, I like to level things off pretty much in my bins. So before I wrap things up over in that feeding area, I figured let's try to take whatever material we'd stacked up over there and level it off, just to see exactly how high we're going to come up against that barrier wall. And you can see I even punched a few holes over here. I didn't know how deep we're going to go, but I think that's pretty good right there. So the last thing I was going to drop in on top of this feeding area was some of the coffee that I bought down here. I've always got a nice supply of, there we go, I've always got a nice supply of used coffee around here. So the worms are always getting fed this stuff. Good, good nitrogen-rich food source. And when you mix it together with all this leafy matter, it should make for a pretty good combination that the worms are really going to enjoy. So So I think just for good measure, I'm going to sprinkle in a little bit more leafy matter just to give it that sort of natural appearance on the top surface. Totally aesthetic from my point of view. And then we can start covering this thing up because we're more or less finished. So at this point, I always, or at least most recently, I try to imagine my bins as being in a certain phase, and in each of those phases, the bin is attempting to reach certain goals. So the same way the goal up until now had been for the worms to deplete all the remaining food within the castings, the new goal at this point is to leave the castings. So I think we've pretty much set the stage for that sort of activity. But we won't really know until we come back in here in a few days or maybe a week's time just to see how it's all progressing. And the same way that the plastic had been covering things up over here previously, I guess we're going to use only a portion of the plastic at this point to cover up, because we'd really like for the moisture in this bin to sort of evaporate out of the material a little bit. And it'll be able to evaporate out of the material through this piece of paper here. It won't evaporate drastically, but it will be able to evaporate a little bit. However, over here, where the feeding area is, as all that frozen food begins to thaw out, and as the worms start breaking it down, and it tries to also evaporate, the plastic will help keep that moisture right there within that feeding area, making it an even more tempting place for the worms to go, not only from a food perspective, but from a moisture perspective as well. So, I've gotten myself a little bit dirty here in the process, but I'm more or less done. I got a couple things I've got to put away, and I got a few things I've got to clean up, but I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. But before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and hopefully you'll be back to see how things progress with this migration of the worms out of the finished castings. Maybe we'll give it another week or so, and we'll check back in to see how things are progressing, and maybe at that point we'll be able to even move the worms out and get them into their new home. So yeah, like I said before, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your time and your company. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.